What happens when we die? That is a question that possesses every person from every faith and background at least once in their lives. After all, how can we possibly hope to truly understand life, or anything for that matter, while not understanding its opposite? To be more specific, how can one truly know how to live the best life possible without knowing what the consequences to our life choices are, if there are any, in death? When numerous philosophical doctrines and cultural differences compete, constantly blurring the lines between right and wrong, one can be tempted to spend a lot of time trying to figure out what happens when we die in order to set things straight, even if we know subconsciously that we will never find an answer. Nonetheless, I surmise that as long as it doesn't interrupt our ability to live life, an investigation into and a contention with the realities of death can be acceptable. But how does one do so in a constructive, healthy way? Plus, it's not like everybody has the capacity to investigate all the religious doctrines regarding life after death, as well as the scientific data gathered from near-death experiences and brain scans. Even then, we probably wouldn't know what to make of it. Maybe it would be easier if there was a piece of media that condensed this data into something approachable. But how could that possibly be done not only successfully, but respectfully to people of all different faiths and backgrounds? It's probably impossible. But that said, there is one movie that made a very admirable attempt. Enter the Void. Released in 2009 and directed by Gaspar Noé, Enter the Void follows a recently deceased man named Oscar on a journey through the afterlife. The things that Oscar sees when he leaves his body are inspired by scientific data, religious concepts, and things attested to by people who have gone through near-death experiences. Though make no mistake, Gaspar Noé did not solely compile this data to illustrate an approximate or definitive vision of the afterlife. Rather, I think he did it to pose a subtle question to the audience. If this is remotely close to what happens when you die, how would you live your life differently? Gaspar trusts that the viewer will attempt to answer that question by focusing on the universal human themes and lessons that can be gleaned from Oscar's journey. And I can safely say that, for myself, he succeeded with flying psychedelic colors. But be warned, Enter the Void will condition your answer by confronting you with reality in its most raw, unadulterated form. Though Enter the Void features many sublime, moving moments, it is also filled with some of the most explicit and emotionally destructive content that you might ever see in a motion picture. It is gut-wrenching, but it needs to be, in order for you to honestly determine how you feel about life, and how you want to live it, if at all. Today, I will analyze the aforementioned concepts that influenced Enter the Void's story, visuals, and structure, so that we might determine what messages they might be trying to communicate. Before I do, I will note that my analysis will be broken into spoiler-free and spoiler-filled sections. I will give ample warning before I transition into the spoiler-filled section, just in case you want to go watch the movie for yourself first. Now, let us begin by taking a look at the events that preceded Oscar's death. Oscar is an American living in Tokyo, Japan. He lives in a cheap apartment with his sister Linda, who he recently brought to live with him when he gathered enough money to buy her a plane ticket. In order to survive, Oscar deals drugs while Linda works as a stripper. One night, after Linda leaves to work a shift, Oscar receives a call from a friend named Victor, requesting that he deliver him drugs that he is owed. Before leaving to deliver Victor's drugs, another friend of Oscar's named Alex shows up, who Oscar then invites to accompany him as he makes his delivery. On the way there, Alex asks Oscar what he thought about a book that he recently gave him, that book being the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Though Oscar says he is enjoying it, he admits to having a hard time understanding it. So for the majority of their walk to Victor, Alex does his best to explain the book's contents. Eventually, they arrive at the meetup spot, a bar that is appropriately named the Void. Alex tells Oscar that he is going to get some food, and will meet up with him once the exchange is completed. Upon entering, Oscar encounters a visibly distressed Victor. Before he can make sense of Victor's emotions, police barge in and try to apprehend Oscar, obviously implying that Victor ratted Oscar out. He escapes into the nearby bathroom and tries to dispose of the drugs before the police can break down the door. In order to try and buy himself time, Oscar claims that he has a gun. A few seconds after making this threat, a policeman fires through the door, and a bullet goes through Oscar's chest. As he slowly bleeds out, the camera's point of view changes from its initial first-person perspective. We look down on Oscar's body from above, and then the camera slowly turns to the light bulb on the ceiling. As it zooms in, the light engulfs everything we see, and Oscar's journey begins. Now, I will describe what Oscar sees momentarily, but before I do, it will help to provide a bit of spoiler-free context. In case you didn't surmise for yourself, some of what Oscar sees is reminiscent of the aforementioned Tibetan Book of the Dead, which supposedly describes what happens to the soul upon death. Aside from only one or two obvious references though, most of the similarities will remain unknown to those unfamiliar. I will quickly lay out the 3 stages that one's soul supposedly goes through in the afterlife, according to the Buddhists. The first stage is known as the Chikai Bardo. Here, the soul witnesses a bright light, which the Buddhists understand as the void of absolute reality, what they would call Dharmakaya. It is the goal of the Buddhist to go into the light and dissolve their ego, thereby releasing themselves from the cycle of reincarnation. To those who are unable to do this, they go into the second stage known as the Kunyad Bardo. Here, the soul experiences the most polar extreme forms of reality, in the forms of both peaceful and wrathful gods, a state that the Buddhists refer to as Sambhogakaya. In respect to the wrathful gods, they will do everything they can to frighten the dead person's soul and/or make it feel like it is being torn to shreds. Unless the soul is able to recognize these deities for what they are, karmic illusions of the mind, then the soul is destined to go to the third stage, the Sidpa Bardo, or Nirmanakaya. Before reincarnating, the soul then chooses which couple they wish to be parented by, and then they are reborn 9 months later. Before I outline how these stages are presented in Enter the Void, I will now issue that spoiler warning I promised before. If you want to watch the movie for yourself before hearing my spoiler-filled analysis, now is the time to bookmark this video and come back to it when you're done. You have been warned. So as I said before, when Oscar dies, the camera turns around and enters the light above him. What he and the audience see is, supposedly, the pulsating light of the Chikai Bardo, the one that his ego is meant to dissolve into. I should note that, as somebody with visual sensitivities, this light is actually pretty difficult to look at when you're watching the movie. Out of concern for others like me, especially those with epilepsy, I had to dim the video. That's how bad it is. When I first watched this, I figured that maybe this assaulting of my sight could be symbolic of what the Chikai Bardo is and our relationship to it. We're supposed to go into it, but our ego is off-put by it because it wishes to preserve itself. The same is inevitably true for Oscar, who refuses to go into it and thus enters the second stage of the Kunyad Bardo. Seeing that Oscar is not a Buddhist, his Kunyad Bardo will not feature peaceful deities and wrathful deities looking to mutilate his soul, but instead must settle for the closest approximation. His Kunyad Bardo is a mixture of 2 things: his life flashing before his eyes, which is common amongst people who have near-death experiences, as well as seeing the effects that his death has on everybody he knew. Instead of seeing peaceful and wrathful deities, he witnesses peaceful and traumatic moments from his life and the lives of his friends and family after he dies. In respect to Oscar's memories, his peaceful moments are primarily from his childhood, things like a trip to the beach with his parents or playing at the park with his sister. His happy memories from adulthood primarily involve him and his sister as well, doing things like watching a sunset or going to an amusement park. His traumatic moments, however, are a whole other ballgame. I cannot actually show most of them because they are way too explicit for YouTube. I can only describe them. The primary traumatic memory happened when Oscar was a child. He was in a car accident with his family, of which he and his sister survived, but his parents did not. He vividly remembers seeing his parents' bloodied corpses and hearing his sister screaming as paramedics pulled her out of the vehicle. The effects of this moment would then go on to heavily influence much of Oscar's life's direction. Interestingly, though, the majority of the traumatic moments in the film are not ones that Oscar suffered, but instead by people negatively affected by Oscar's life choices. I will cite what I believe is the worst out of many instances. During dinner with his friend Victor and his parents, Oscar talks about his desire to bring his sister to Tokyo to live with him. Victor's mother offers to pay for that plane ticket, but in exchange, he must have sex with her, to which Oscar consents. Eventually, Victor deduces what happened between Oscar and his mother, and predictably seeks revenge. This is why Oscar was confronted by the police at the beginning of the film. Victor did not predict, however, that this confrontation would result in Oscar's death. The aftermath of Oscar's death leads Victor down a path of extreme darkness. He suffers a psychotic break. He is violently attacked and thrown out by his parents, who now hate each other, and he is told by Oscar's sister to go die. And then Victor makes matters worse by saying Linda was partly to blame for Oscar's death, which results in her own psychotic break. It is brutal, and remember, this is just one of many unconscionable situations that this film presents. Situations that try to emulate the soul-crushing powers of the wrathful deities. The underlying point here is that Oscar had a very difficult life due to factors both within and outside of his control. As we see Oscar's life, he, and by extension the audience, must determine how they feel about a world that is capable of these instances of extreme peace and horror. If we were in Oscar's shoes, would we still choose life if it meant going through unconscionable things just to get to the good moments? How do we know that life's challenges wouldn't drive us to do terrible things like Oscar did, making the lives of our loved ones worse? It's one thing to try and answer these questions on a random whim, but when a film like Enter the Void presents reality to us in its most unfiltered form, showing us things that we would rather go our entire lives without looking at, it tends to make our answers a lot more honest. As for Oscar, he makes his choice when he enters the Sidpa Bardo. At this point, he enters a Japanese love motel and watches several couples engaging in intercourse. Here, he must choose which womb he wishes to be reborn into. He goes through many of them, constantly refusing reincarnation, either due to a perceived incompatibility or, in my opinion, because he does not wish to be reborn. However, the last couple he sees makes him change his mind. He sees his friend Alex engaged in intercourse with his sister Linda. Yeah, I know it's weird, just try to go with it. At this moment, he remembers a promise that he made to his sister early on in life. He said that no matter what happens, they would always be together. Intending to fulfill his promise, Oscar enters his sister's womb and is reborn, thereby signaling his desire to choose life, despite all the misery it caused him the first time around. I imagine that for most people who watch this movie for the first time, this would be the interpretation that they project. It's a powerful, life-affirming message that can appeal to anybody regardless of what they believe happens in the afterlife. However, to parallel the movie's goal of presenting reality in its most unadulterated form, I must regrettably inform you that this is not how the director interprets his movie. Though Gaspar Noé did make this film so that it could be reasonably read as a tale of reincarnation, he personally has a much bleaker view. In an interview with Den of Geek, Noé draws our attention to the film's final scene where Oscar is supposedly reborn. He notes that we do not see the face of the mother. Though the audience suspects it would be Linda, Noé suggests that it was actually Oscar's mother. What this implies is that Oscar's desire to reincarnate was a failure, and that the last thing he sees before he dies was, to use Noé's words, the most traumatic moment of his life, his birth. What this implies is that the Buddhist interpretation could, ironically, be an illusion. The only reason Oscar saw the bright lights and the mating couples and all of that was because his mind was influenced by the Tibetan Book of the Dead before he died. Now that he is dying, his brain is playing tricks on him. This goes back to what I said before about how the film is a combination of both religious and scientific data. For instance, you could say that the bright light that Oscar sees when he first begins his journey is the Chikai bardo, but one could also say that reduced blood flow to the visual periphery of the retina during death causes our perception of light to distort, either in the form of a blinding light or a light at the end of a tunnel, as is commonly reported. The same is true for all other commonly reported phenomena that this film depicts: seeing the world from the top down, life flashing before your eyes, a seemingly divine light. How can one say for certain that these events are supernatural, or the brain's last hurrah before it permanently ceases its function? Thus, we are left with two interpretations of what happens to Oscar. He either reincarnates and becomes his sister's child, or he dies and leaves his promise to his sister unfulfilled. Though neither interpretation gets us any closer to knowing what truly happens in death, they both provide a useful way to respond to death and whatever it has in store for us. One thing remains true regardless of what truly happened to Oscar. He wanted to reincarnate. The love he felt for his sister was enough that he was willing to go through life again with full knowledge of how terrible it could be. It's just a shame that he wasn't able to nurture and appreciate that love while he was still alive, so it might help him make better choices for himself and those around him. Unfortunately, like with so many things in life, one never really knows what they have until they lose it. In Oscar's case, he didn't know how much better his life could have been until he died, and depending on how you interpret the film, he made the one life that he and his loved ones got even worse. Maybe there is a chance that we reincarnate, but then again, maybe there isn't. Maybe this is the only life we have. Whatever the case may be, the answer remains the same. Live life as if it is the only one you got. Make good choices, and let love guide your way, for it will always help you overcome the greatest darkness.